This was never a money issue. There's been a prevailing feeling of respect that wasn't being given. For 11 years of my life I've spent trying to represent this sport with integrity.
I've always wanted what was right for me and right for us as fighters. It's not about the company. Everywhere you look, it's about UFC, Dana White and UFC. And I'm gonna speak out, I'm gonna say stuff. They just signed a huge deal with Spike TV for 3 years for $100 million. What, Dana got in the octagon and fought? Fertitta's got in the octagon and fight? No, they put their money up to fighters to make that happen for them. Now this fighter should be collecting some of that.
I'm broke, so I need to fight.
You know, they were the ones that said, listen, you're gonna have to go broke for a little bit. I had to get a loan. I knew coming in here tonight that my whole paycheck was just gonna go back to that loan.
Of the people who are making 30 to 40 million off of us every time, I feel like a slave. I feel like a hooker. All of a sudden, I'm getting pimped out by these guys.
They will be the top of the food chain, total monopoly, complete control of the industry. That will just be that.
So, for those of you that haven't been paying attention to the news recently, you might have heard that the UFC has to pay up $335 million at the end of a lawsuit to a bunch of fighters that were suing them, a class action lawsuit. Well, it's not as bad as it sounds, because it turns out this lawsuit was asking for a lot more than that, like massive amounts of things, like changes to fighter contracts. What you saw with Francis Ngannou might have started to become the norm, that sort of thing. And essentially what they've all of a sudden started to do, when it felt like they're at the 1 yard line, like they were literally next month supposed to finally go to court and actually start adjudicating this, they decided to settle. So $335 million sounds like a lot of money, because it is. To all of us, the rest of the world, it is. But to the UFC, who's worth $12 billion, it's a little more than slap on the wrist, don't get me wrong. But now everybody, all their contracts are all ironclad. There's no problem with them whatsoever. And what this means is what we want to chat about today. What this means in terms of the industry, what this means in terms of competitors like PFL, Bellator. Yeah, it's kind of a shocking result, and maybe not as shocking for some. Of course, you know myself, Jason, and Alex. We've got our friend Tommy here on a damn monitor, as we've been teasing many times. I think this is your second time with us, Tommy.
This is my second time. Thank you for giving me a microphone and a mug this time. I like it.
That's right. First off, did I summarize that okay? Beyond that, what are your reactions to this? What are your thoughts?
No, I thought you summarized it really well. And we have a couple other videos about it if you guys want to watch them and learn more about it. But the thing is, this particular type of case would have been almost like a landmark case in the United States, because there's not a ton of antitrust lawsuits that are related to the type of thing that the fighters were suing for that have ever gone through trial. So it would have been a major thing. And because there's no precedent, there's a lot of questions about would it succeed, which is why I'm sure the fighters were thinking, or particularly their lawyers, we don't know how well this is going to go. And for the UFC too, remember, there was a ton to lose, potentially billions of dollars. So they, of course, would want to make a settlement too, especially if the fighters wanted to. So it was a situation where both sides were probably thinking, I don't know if we're going to succeed here.
Why were they suing the UFC?
So they were suing the UFC for anti-competitive practices, essentially. They were arguing that the UFC was artificially suppressing wages on fighters and owning the market on elite level talent. Other promotions weren't able to get going because they didn't have the access to these elite level fighters, because the UFC was tying them all up in these contracts. That's essentially what it was about.
So basically they're arguing they have unfair contracts and that they're owed past wages. The fighters were essentially getting massively ripped off in terms of what they're getting paid, right?
Yes, the contracts were not up to the standard of other sports that they should have been getting based on the revenue. I think they said around 20% was going to the fighters is what their argument was, and it should be higher than that. And more so than that, this type of lawsuit, an antitrust suit, is designed to punish through monetary gain. So that's why there's like treble damages. That's why they triple if you win. So the money would have more been like, hey, don't do this. This isn't right. And other companies don't do this because look how much they had to pay when they screwed this up.
It is something that could have like shook the whole industry. So we talked about it a lot, but now that it is settled, like how likely was it really at the end of the day that this was even going to go all the way? Because it was pretty unlikely they were going to win. You know what I mean?
Nate Quarry was one of the fighters involved in this lawsuit.
Yeah.
And he put out a statement saying, hey guys, I know for a lot of people that were hoping we were going to stick this thing all the way through, the reality is we were going to spend about 10 more years in this process, because a lot of this stuff just gets, kind of kicked down the road as more and more elements start to build and it gets more complex.
The injunctive relief as well. They would have had to combine the lawsuits and then reapply, which would have taken, a long time as well.
Yeah. So by the time it was all done, it was like, and we might lose.
Yeah.
And so it was like, okay, $335 million or potentially losing over the course of 10 more years.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely a huge factor in it. And honestly, like I spoke with some lawyers when we were doing some of the other videos, and even a professor that studies antitrust. None of them privately seemed very optimistic about this ever being successful in terms of going all the way through to trial and then a verdict. And when you consider how much time it would take, how much money it would take, and how much more money the UFC has to battle that, because the fighters only have so much, right? The lawyers can only put so much into this on their end because they don't have those resources. So yeah, I mean, the idea that it was going to be anything other than a settlement is probably a little too pie in the sky, unrealistic.
Is this actually turned out to be worse for fighters? Because now there is a contract provision that says, which is crazy if you ask me, you cannot be involved in a class action lawsuit anymore. So they're like, the idea of this even happening is scratched. It's gone. This is what it's going to be. You've all signed contracts now, so you can't retroactively sue us for anything related to, issues with wages. Connor says he's the most underpaid fighter ever, right? Because obviously he generates the kind of revenue a boxer gets, but doesn't get the payday. The lower card, Cheyenne Vlismas, she was co-headlining on a card not too long ago, and she was talking about how she was broke and living out of her car.
Jared Cannonier.
She was the co-main event. Yeah, Jared Cannonier.
The fact that it's now over, and like you said, they have these provisions, and other companies now are going to be able to look at this and say, okay, well, we can do this, this, and this, and don't have to worry about it because we know that no suit is going to be brought forward because we know that it's not going to succeed. Yeah, this was massive. Now, I can't say that it was a bad idea to try, but you're right. I mean, obviously, they've made some provisions. And here's the thing, and I talked with John Nash about this in the previous video. Some things have come from this that were positive, even just in the process. Like the sunset clauses that the UFC now has on their contracts, those came as a result of this situation and them worrying about future litigation.
They started to close those now. Like now they've like, oh yeah, we realize what this opened up, Pandora's box essentially, with their heavyweight champion leaving. So now sunset clauses, and I'm not going to say I understand the full details of it, but my understanding is sunset clauses are nowhere near as effective as they were in Ngannou's contracts moving forward, because obviously they don't want that to ever happen again.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, then, yeah, it's over. This is pretty much it. I mean, look, you talked about boxing. The thing is, boxing changed because of a federal government intervention. There's literally the only way you're going to get anything like that. And we've talked about how the Ali Act would be a difficult thing to adapt to MMA, and fans would not be happy with a lot of the changes. But that would be really the only thing left. We know a fighters union is never going to happen. It would have already happened if it was going to. There's enough awareness of it in the community through fighters at this point, and there's been some pretty strong efforts to do that. I just don't ever see it happening.
Yeah,
so your only other option is federal intervention.
The problem with the union is that there's always someone else who's going to take the fight. Like, if you've got two ranked guys in the UFC and you want them to fight and they're trying to like hold out for negotiating power, there's going to be some random guy who's not even in the UFC who'll take that fight. So it's the same with the union. You can try and support each other, but there's always going to be people who aren't in it who are going to come in and take the opportunity away from the people who are trying to battle. It's in any creative industry or any industry where you are like a singular person, you know, it's people will just swoop in and undercut you.
So this was one of the issues, right? So with a class action lawsuit, a big part of it is, particularly with a monopsony or monopoly case, either one of those is the idea of, well, how does it actually affect the viewer, the person who's paying to buy this? And I think that was one of the harder things to kind of go along with. I think you can make a few arguments like, oh yeah, if fighters aren't being paid more, maybe they're not going to be as attracted to the sport. They're going to become an NFL football player in the States or a basketball player instead, because they know like $750,000 is the minimum for a bench warmer in the NFL. Whereas you're making, 10-10, 12-12 starting in the UFC. So yeah, maybe that's not going to be your first route. So you can make that argument. But the other side of that, on the devil's advocate side of it, is I fucking love the organization of the UFC. Speaking personally, I actually do. I love the fact that I can see this through line directly from the bottom ranks all the way to the top. And so when you think of something like that in boxing, sure, you can find ways, but you have to connect the dots a whole lot more yourself. There's this nice packaged product that the UFC has that they get to organize from the top to the bottom. I want to see the best fight the best. I want to see Sean O'Malley, when he's saying, I want to move up weight class, be like, no, you have to fight Merab. And he doesn't have a choice.
Yeah.
In boxing, there's so much freedom. A lot of times it doesn't happen. It's like, how long have they been chasing that Tyson Fury-Usyk fight? It's finally maybe going to happen. For a long time, they wanted Tyson Fury versus Anthony Joshua. Maybe that's going to happen now after the Ngannou result, but it's long in the tooth, years after when it should have happened.
If you ask me, if you want to think negatively, it's like the lesser of two evils. It's like, do you want two guys who can negotiate endlessly and may never fight, or do you want one company that controls everything? Both have their flaws, don't they, really, unfortunately?
Well, ultimately, that was the real big issue with the case, is that antitrust is normally about consumer welfare. And you'd be hard-pressed to find MMA fans that are feeling like MMA is hurting in any way, shape, or form with the UFC being in the position that they're in. And the other part of that is, normally antitrust is about the opposite of what this case was, which is there's one person that is selling to everybody and that's it. But in this case, it was one person buying everything, buying all the fighters. So it's affecting a labor market. So how does that affect the end user? That is the real issue. And because there's not that many cases that have ever been tried about that thing, there's really no precedent. There's really no, antitrust kind of wasn't built for that. So it's why it was always going to be difficult anyway. And yeah, fans don't care. Like you said, they're getting everything they want all in one place in a nice, neat package. So of course, on the consumer end, yeah, it's very hard to argue against the UFC.
Yeah, we want the NFL in MMA. Of course, the major difference is they do have a union. They have the Players Association. So they have a ton of bargaining power. I mean, I think it's basic stuff, So, they signed that Reebok deal. They signed the Venom deal.
Yeah.
They signed the ESPN. I mean, especially the ESPN one worth several billion. None of the fighters get a cut of that.
No, yeah.
You're in the video game, and even the closest, most analogous industry to this is actually pro wrestling, because they're also contractors, but they get likeness rights. Anytime they're in a video game, they'll get a cut of that.
Yeah, that's true.
In the UFC, you don't get shit for it. That was the big thing with Randy Couture. A big part of it was ancillary rights. His likeness in perpetuity.
Yeah.
In perpetuity, which means forever in UFC video games,
I mean,
so he was like, I'm not signing that.
He's not in any UFC video games, Randy Couture, but he is in the EA MMA game.
Because he did get ancillary rights.
Yeah.
Name me an industry where the athletes don't get a cut of their likeness being used in the games, on TV. They get none of it. DVD sales, they weren't getting cuts of that. Chuck Liddell's greatest hits, Ultimate Knockouts. Not a dime.
Yeah.
And you could say just don't sign those contracts, but if you want to be a fighter, are you going to sign with PFL and then have the very same fans that are saying, why sign the contract? Those very same fans often, I'm not saying every fan that says that, but often are the same ones that are then also saying, you're fighting in the B leagues, you're a scrub. I was watching Luke Thomas talk about this, and he was like, your ability as another promoter just got way worse.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Because the one hope you had, the one glimmer is, maybe you could be Don Davis in PFL and match Ngannou with John Jones if something like this went through. Now you have no prayer of that. The UFC is never going to co-promote. They're not making any money in one. They're not making any money in PFL. Bellator, I believe at one point was, but I think that kind of changed. Well, how does that affect the end user? And I think a lot of fans are going to be on the side of that and say, well, doesn't affect me at all. And I do think there are a lot of fighters or fans that don't care that what a fighter's making.
I mean, like I said before, I didn't think it was going to succeed. And I've said that several times in other videos. Maybe it would have been a landmark case in the United States for labor markets and antitrust, but that's not what happened. And so now, going forward, I mean, barring government intervention, which I absolutely do not see because MMA is not that big a deal. You know, boxing was a national pastime. You know, boxing was a big deal when they decided to intervene. So, like, even though you've had Mark Wayne Mullen, you know, introduce a bill, nobody cared about that. No senator is like, oh man, this is important, you know? So it's never going to happen that way either. Ultimately, at the end of the day, the fighters are both the labor force and the product itself, which is why if they ever did get together, and I'm not saying a union in the actual legal sense, but collective bargaining, if the fighters somehow all got together and said, hey, guess what? None of us are doing anything until we get a piece of the pie. The UFC would have no choice because that is the product. And yeah, sure, it's guys on the low end they wouldn't care about. But if every single talent, including all the people that are making the money, were just like, nope, we're not going to do it, they wouldn't really have much recourse other than taking them to court. That would be the only ever way, but I don't see that happening either. Because, again, everybody's in their own best interest. And for a lot of these guys, their own individual interest is not the collective interest. This is pretty much it. The UFC won. I know they didn't win the case technically, but they pretty much did. The $335 million across those 1,200 fighters, that's not going to be much for most of them. You know, this is the best possible outcome for the UFC, honestly, because they didn't have to go through another 10 years of litigation, and there's probably not going to be any contract changes whatsoever. This was a victory, regardless of the monetary amount. That's nothing to the UFC.
I don't think it's what Nate Quarry wanted.
No, they wanted
I don't think it's what Kung Lee wanted, you know, at all. Everybody that was involved in the case. And we will find out because, you know, this still has to be submitted to the courts for approval. There still is this whole process of, okay, what were the terms of the settlement? We still don't quite know. I imagine it's going to be almost entirely money and anything else is going to be really tiny. But yeah, more than likely what it's tantamount to in comparison to what it would have been is a slap on the wrist. Yeah. It's $335 million. It's a fuck ton, but it's not $4 billion.
Yeah, massive shout out to our members, our Hall of Famers. All of you are awesome. You make this type of content possible.
If you are somebody that enjoys these discussions, you want to get the full unedited version of these. They're a lot longer than what they turn out to be edited in the end. You can watch the full thing. And that's our cheapest tier. So why don't you just go ahead and click join below or click the link and support the channel. Appreciate it, guys.